Well, welcome to the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast. I'm Denise Beck, and I'm so glad you're here to join us for the last episode of Season 2. It's going to be a special one, even though I think I say that every month. Although you may not be familiar with the name of the legacy story we are featuring this month, you probably have heard of the book Streams in the Desert. So buckle up as Sarah and Dr. Laura Chevalier Beer welcome a special guest to tell you the story of Lettie Burd Cowman. We're so glad you're joining us, and we're so thankful for Barnabas International for sponsoring the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast.
Hey friends, I'm Sarah Hilkeman, and we're so glad that you are here for this month's legacy story. We love bringing these stories to you of women from the past, not because we want to make them out to be heroes or put them on this pedestal, but because we feel like there's so much that we can learn from these women and their legacies. And so we are so excited to bring you another one of those stories this month. I am here with Dr. Laura Chevalier Beer, our Velvet Ashes resident scholar. Laura, so glad to be with you. And can you tell us about our topic and our guest today?
Yes, I'm so excited again to be bringing a guest to our podcast this month. We've been so blessed by some experts in the field of mission history. And so this month we had set aside to focus on Lettie Burd Cowman. And some of you might have heard of her before. She's quite a famous missionary, but you might not know all of her life story. And so we are very privileged this month to have an expert on her life here with us. And her name is Michelle Ewell. And she was connected to us by OMS, which is the organization that Lettie helped found. And so we're excited that Michelle is willing to offer her expertise and share with us the story. Let me just tell you a little bit more about Michelle. She's the author of 2 biographies, actually. The most recent one is Overflowing Faith, Lettie Cowman and Streams in the Desert. And before that, she also wrote Mrs. Oswald Chambers, the woman behind the world's best-selling devotional. She's also an essayist, a longtime blogger, and a best-selling author of inspirational historical novellas. Michelle is a 40-year Bible study teacher in various Christian settings and denominations, and she studied English literature at UCLA and trained as a reporter. She's also an amateur genealogist, and she lives with her family in Northern California. So she has quite the rich history, and we're excited for her to join us today. And maybe, Michelle, you could just start us off by talking to us about why you decided to write a biography of Lettie Cowman.
Well, I actually originally wrote a biography of Biddy Chambers and had such a wonderful time writing about Biddy. Loved the whole process. It just was all my sweet spots. It was stories, it was history, it was even genealogy. And I had such a good time. I thought, I want to write another biography. What would be a good topic? Who could I write about? And I thought, well, I mean, the 2 best-selling devotionals of the last century were My Utmost for His Highest and Streams in the Desert. So I thought, I'll write about Streams in the Desert. So I contacted one mission society. Lettie and Charles initially founded the Oriental Missionary Society in 1901, Japan. But, maybe around 1945, 1950, after the Second World War, they changed the name. And it's now, because it's worldwide, not just in the Orient, it's now One Mission Society. Still has the OMS initials, but it's a different name. So I contacted them, and right before COVID hit, I went out and spent a couple of weeks in their archives, which was terrific. Just so rich, a rich life story, even bigger than Biddy's, and then just so many facets and information and bits and pieces. It's a great story, and I'm delighted to be talking about it.
Michelle, you mentioned this devotional, Streams in the Desert. Can you talk about the significance of this? I think I was seeing it was written 100 years ago or published 100 years ago this year. Is that right?
This is correct. This is the centenary anniversary of the publication of Streams in the Desert. It's a interesting devotional in that when Lettie put it together with her husband, Charles, Charles was like, I don't really think this is the greatest idea, but go ahead. And they only printed 3,000 copies. They were a self-publisher in essence. And they figured, well, we'll see what happens. And they sold them all out really fast. Charles Cowman died that year, the year the book came out, but he lived long enough to see that book was a success. And it has continued ever since. People are very moved by what she has to say and the reasons behind it.
Yeah, I would imagine even if people haven't heard her name, they've probably heard of the devotional.
Right.
Totally. And and I like to say that Streams in the Desert was really the hinge of her life. People think most of the time they think, oh, Streams in the Desert, Lettie Cowman. But she had a very full life up until that book, and then a very full life after that book. And frankly, the book itself caused a lot of things to happen in her life following its publication.
Yeah, maybe you could just elaborate on that a little bit more. This idea that Streams in the Desert was only the hinge for her life. Can you give us a little background on what preceded that in her earlier life, and then what followed that?
Well, Streams in the Desert really was the reason that her life completely changed. She was a missionary with her husband, Charles, in Japan beginning in 1901. But whereas she was full of vigor and vim for the missionary movement, her real gifts were in speaking and singing. She had a beautiful voice. She was actually a trained soprano, and just was very warm and wonderful with her storylines. And so she and Charles spent actually most of the time that they were ostensibly in Japan, traveling back and forth on deputation tours, raising money to keep the Bible Training Institute they'd founded in Tokyo going. Well, with all of that traveling, she used that time to collect church bulletins, reading magazines, books herself, loved to have hymnals at her beck and call. And out of the magazines, the church bulletins, all those little missionary letters, she would cut out significant items and she would put them into a manila envelope. And then when it came time, and they were always encouraging things, what to do, and stories about famous people and so on and so forth. And then she took all of the best of those clippings, those encouraging words, and turned them into Streams in the Desert, in part. And she particularly looked at those that dealt with encouragement and grief because her husband was dying when she put Streams together, really. And so she was, well, that's a whole long story that will come. But she was trying to find ways to encourage him at night with his pain. And that's what all these clippings were. And then she put them together into the book.
And so where did she grow up? What was her family background before she became a missionary?
She actually is a kin, or she's not a kin, but she's she grew up just like Laura Ingalls Wilder. If she was on the banks of Plum Creek, she would actually be Nellie Olson, the daughter of the banker, not Laura and Mary and Carrie. But she grew up 300 miles west of Plum Creek in the southwestern corner of Iowa, a town called Thayer and Afton. Her father was a very well-off farmer, and then he ended up becoming the banker in the town. She was the eighth of the children in her family, and her mother was 49 years old when she was born. Wow. Her father, 50. And it kind of scandalized her siblings who were, like teenagers, like, what happened here? And she was raised as a princess. She wore beautiful ruffled clothing, always had a beautiful bow in her hair. We have a picture of her when she's about 10, and she looks like she's just stepped out of a fashion plate. Curly hair. She was a sweet girl. She sang, she did music, she loved art. And like Laura Ingalls Wilder, she went to the same sort of school with the McGuffey Readers. If you know anything about the McGuffey Readers, they were all about poetry and music and patriotism. And that just engendered in her this love for how words were used, how things sounded, great patriotism. And that served her well in the life that she eventually came to have. Mm-hmm. Charles Cowman came into her life when she was 13 years old. Charles was involved in the up-and-coming high-tech industry of the time, which was telegraphy. He became fascinated with telegraphy, and when he was 14, 15 years old, he studied telegraphy one entire summer and then was hired by Western Union to take a shift on the telegraphy unit at a small, well, actually in Thayer, but he grew up on a smaller town. And Lettie's mother happened to be walking by one day and struck up a conversation with this thin 15-year-old. And she just thought he looked like he needed some mothering. So she invited him home to tea, not thinking, oh, I have a beautiful 13-year-old daughter at home. Why would you think that? I mean, that would never have dawned on me when I had a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old maybe, but not the 13-year-old. And she would invite him home for tea, and he just drank in this different life on a wealthy farm. And Mrs. Bird didn't suspect anything, so she encouraged them to go out and boat and ride horses or walk through the fields and all of that, and didn't see what was happening underneath. So one day his mother wrote him a letter and said, look, you're with people who are far above your class. You need to get out of there before you get hurt. And he thought about it and thought, well, my mom says I should go. So he put in for a transfer with the Western Union. But before he left, he asked if he could take Lettie for a walk in the yard again. Sure, her mom doesn't suspect anything. And they are off on this walk, and he looks at her and he says, well, I love you, and I have to go away, but will you wait for me? Okay, she's 13, right? She thinks about it and she says, I'll wait. I will. So off he went with this promise in hand, not telling anyone. No one knew this except the two of them. And he went off to fame and fortune as a telegrapher because he was really very good. And when he got a job, I think he'd asked her to wait 7 years. Will you wait 7 years for me? Just like Joseph did with Leah and so forth. Not Leah, he wanted Rachel. And she's waiting. And so she graduates from high school, and her parents are like trying to match her with the banker's son, not the banker's son, but the banker's assistant and this person and that person. And she just isn't interested, even though she's becomes a fashion plate. And they're making plans to send her to Europe to become a trained soprano in Europe. But she kept saying, no, I don't think so, because she's waiting. And Charles Cowman blew back into town when he was 20. She was 18. He beat his deadline by a year. And he went to see her and said, did you wait? And she said, yes. So then they went to talk to her parents, and her father didn't have a clue who this guy was. Who is this? And she said, this is Charlie Cowman, who used to come to tea. And he's like, what? What? And he looks at Charles and says, I don't know about this. And Charles Cowman says, why don't you ask her what she wants? And he looks at his daughter and she said, I would like to marry him. And the father is like, what? But once Lettie made a decision, she never changed her mind. You see this all through her life. She was good for her word, no matter what she said, no matter what she had to do. And she said she'd marry Charles Cowman, and here he was. So she married him. Oh. It's just the funniest thing. He was the station master of a U.S. Western Union telegraph office in a mountain town in Colorado. So they got on the train, off they went back to this town in Colorado, high in the mountains. He was dealing with miners and ore, and it was a rough and tumble town. And apparently he didn't want to be parted from his brand new wife, and so he taught her how to do telegraphy, which was good because he discovered in the course of all this that this was the daughter of a banker. She didn't know how to do housework. She didn't know how to cook. And there he was.
Oh, wow.
And they were blissfully happy for maybe a year and a half, but then she got really ill, and the doctors declared her heart was not strong enough to handle the high elevations. They were at close to 10,000 feet. And the doctor looked at Charlie and just said, if you don't get her down, you're going to lose her. So he applied for a transfer. He was such a fine telegrapher that they moved him to Chicago. Is this a deal now? And they moved him right up the ranks. He did very, very well. And by the time they got to Chicago in 1892, in time for the Chicago World's Fair, she was a polished, poised, beautifully dressed young woman who was the talk of her community and liked to go to tea and all these elegant women things. And all was going well. She was even taking piano lessons when she got a piece of mail that changed her life.
Don't leave us hanging. What was this piece of mail that she got?
She found an invitation to hear an opera singer sing at a church not far from where they lived, which happened to be not far from the Moody Church there in Chicago. So she liked opera. She and Charles went to the opera all the time because they were among the intelligentsia, poised women of Chicago, poised couple of Chicago. And she went and heard this, and she had never heard a gospel presentation like this before, centered on opera. And she went home and thought about it. Well, the woman was speaking 5 nights in a row, but she thought, I can't go back to that. I can't give up my life. It's so beautiful that Charles has put together for me. But she went back the next night and the next night. Charles worked at night, so she could do this, or most nights. And on the 4th night, the woman sitting next to her said, are you going to go forward? And Lettie said, and she said, I'll go with you. And she walked up to the front to the altar, and Lettie knelt at the altar and made a commitment to Christ. Once she made a decision, she didn't change. Mm-hmm. So when Charles found out the next morning, he was apoplectic. You can't do this to me. I can't be a religious man. You're going to ruin my life, all the work I've done. And she said, I have to. And she gave away all of her novels. She got rid of all of her popular music. She only played hymns. She got a Bible. And Charles was distraught.
And a big change.
Yeah, she encouraged him to come to meetings. He didn't want to do anything. And he came in one night and he said, all right, I've got tickets to the opera tonight. And she said, I can't go to the opera. I have to go to a church meeting. And he said, how can you do this to me? I've got these tickets. And she said, I'm going to my church meeting. So she went to the church meeting and he went to the opera for 5 minutes and couldn't bear not having her. They had this really intense relationship, totally focused on each other when she wasn't off at church, of course. They never had any children, and it may very well have been that the incident in Colorado was her losing a child because she wasn't strong enough to carry. Never found that out. She never talked about it, but there was concerns about her heart. Well, so they went on like this for a couple of weeks, and Charles was absolutely miserable. Lettie was afraid her marriage was ending, and then one day he agreed to go with her to hear someone speak. Apparently just nearly fell apart in the pew, just really, really upset. But he did not go forward. But he was almost near hysterical as they were walking home. And she thought, this is it. This is the end of the marriage. But when they got home to their beautiful apartment, he turned off the lights and he said, I'm a sinful man. You've got to help me find the Lord.
Wow.
And she's not been a Christian very long. She's trying her best to explain the gospel of salvation to him. He probably knew more than she did because he'd been raised in a Christian family. And he became a Christian that night, and the marriage was saved. The next day, he went to work at Western Union, and he's now a Christian. He's got to talk to people. He talked to one of the men who worked with him, who just looked at him and said, And he thought, and then he went on home, and he thought, well, gosh, I'm not going to be a very good evangelist. But that was Ernest Kilbourne. First person he shared the gospel with, Ernest Kilbourne, his colleague, came back the next day and said, I've given my life to Christ. I'm all in with you.
Oh, wow.
And Ernest Kilbourne was one of the founders of the Oriental Missionary Society.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
They soon realized that they didn't know enough. So they started taking classes there at the Moody Bible Institute and started reading their Bibles. They went to meetings constantly. Charles was such a vigorous evangelist. He began speaking on Sundays in Hell's Kitchen to the impoverished men. There were a lot of men in Chicago at that time. The World's Fair had closed, but they didn't have jobs. So there was a lot of tension there, and there was almost like a Skid Row type of a place. And he preached there. He and Ernest Kilbourne began preaching to everyone within the Western Union Telegraph. And he was a manager, so he was pretty important. Finally, they rented a room on Sundays so that the men could come over from their shifts, and Charles Cowman would preach the gospel. So really all in, really motivated to do whatever God called them to do. And then one day they met an interesting man at church.
Is this how they got to Japan?
Well, he was the instrument through which they met him. They were involved with the holiness movement, and his name was Yuji Nakata. He was considered the quote unquote D.L. Moody of Japan. He was a martial arts expert who became a Christian when his mother became a Christian. And his mother was one of the first Christians in Japan. He had a very typical Japanese upbringing. And when his wife died and his child died, he decided he needed to know the Lord better. And he wrote to D.L. Moody to ask him what to do. And D.L. Moody said, come to my Bible school. So he did. He went to the Moody Bible Institute, and he met the Cowmans the first Sunday he was there. And they sort of adopted him. They funded him there because Charles was pouring all of the money he made from his formidable salary. He made more money than the President of the United States did in the 1890s. But he put it all into missions work. And they bought Juji Nakata books. They were constantly giving money to missions. They were really caught into that. And at one mission meeting, it may have been with A.B. Simpson, they passed a hat. They told a story about missionaries. And Charles Cowman took all the money in his wallet and put it in the plate. When the plate came around again, he looked at it and he took off his gold watch and put it in the plate. And then he looked at Lettie and said, your diamond ring? And he said, we're all in. And she said, all right. And she took off her diamond ring and put it in. And they were all in for missions. So all of this was going on there toward the end of the 1890s. And one day they were reading a magazine written by somebody over there on my bookshelf who had opened a Bible school in Cincinnati that he called the God's Bible School. And the first class was starting. And Charles and Lettie looked at each other and decided to sell everything they had and go to Bible school. Well, Western Union people were really, really upset. You can't do this to us. You make so much money. He said, well, I want to go start a Bible school in Japan. Or no, just want to go start a Bible school. I want to be a missionary. And they said, look, make a lot of money and you can send everyone. You don't have to do this. This is like Bill Gates going in and said, okay, I'm done with computers. I'm going to go become a missionary. If only that had happened. So he and Lettie sold everything. They moved to Cincinnati. They were the first students at God's Bible School. And the president of the Bible school heard that they wanted to go on the missions field. And they had looked into going to India, but Lettie's health wasn't good enough. And the doctor had said, you take your wife to India, you'll bring back a corpse. No, you should not go. So they were just going to school and biding their time, really. And then the president of the school said, well, why do you have to go with the missionary organization? Why don't you just go? And they said, well, I guess we could. But they'd given everything away. They'd sold everything. They had no money left. They were living on donations from other people. And someone sold a piece of property and sent enough money for them to take a sailing ship from San Francisco to Tokyo. Juji Nakata, who had put this idea into their head, was waiting for them, and off they went. And that was in February of 1901.
Okay. What did their families think about all of this?
Well, Charles Cowman's parents were Christians, and they were fine. They sort of disappear from the story for quite a while until later on in the story. Lettie's family she had already thrown them enough spanners in the works that they were okay with it, I guess. She would always visit her siblings over the years, but her parents died fairly young. Her mother was gone. Her father was gone in the 1890s. Her mother some years later, but yeah. So off they went.
So anyway, Michelle, the Cowmans ended up in Japan as independent missionaries, and where did things go from there?
So they had a building and they started right away. That's the first thing they did is they began their Bible Training Institute. Juji Nakata was a noted speaker, and he spoke every night. He gave a gospel message every night at a mission hall not far from where the school was. And the students came pretty much through there. They were Japanese students, men and women. Among them was a daughter from the royal house of Japan who came and became a Bible woman. I'm sure you've run into Bible women in your conversations.
We just actually highlighted them a couple months ago.
Yeah, I mean, Bible women were the entrees into so many of these households. And in this case, this Bible woman later, she went through the program. She ended up going to Taiwan, which was then called Formosa, and married a man who was the head of a chief of a headhunter tribe. And she lived her whole life up in the hinterlands of Formosa. But this is the type of person that they were gathering in. Anyway, Juji Nakata preached at this, what eventually became a gospel hall. They did 3,000 straight nights of preaching a gospel message there in Tokyo. They put the school together pretty quickly. And within a couple of, maybe even a year or two, they realized that they had to raise funds. And so the best ones were Lettie and Charles to go back to America to raise money. And this is when the starting of the deputation tours began. Well, Ernest Kilbourne had joined them. He joined them a year later with his family. And 2 years after the school began, Lettie and Charles were elsewhere. Kilbourne was called downstairs because there were some odd-looking men jabbering in a language that no one knew. And he went downstairs, and they were wearing odd hats. They had strange shoes on, big pantaloon pants, and no one could seem to understand what they wanted to know until one of them pointed at the cross on the school and said, "Alleluia." And Kilbourne said, "Alleluia, we've got you." And they were 3 men from Korea who ended up becoming the first 3 Korean converts through Bible Training Institute. It was among the first 3 in Korea itself. And since they were attached to the holiness movement, the Korean Holiness Church to this day in Korea is one of the largest churches in the country. And it began in part with these 3 men. So their ministry began almost immediately. Juji Nakata, they kind of take turns doing mission work or, deputation to work. Juji Nakata went to England, where he met Oswald Chambers in 1906, invited him to come back to God's Bible School in 1907 to teach, which OC did. And then Chambers was really interested in missionary movement. And so then Nakata and Oswald Chambers trained all the way across the United States and sailed to Japan, where he met the Cowmans and was just so impressed by the school that they had put together, the Bible Training Institute for missionaries, because OMS's philosophy was we needed to train the locals, the nationals, to share the gospel because they understood it better than anyone else did. And Chambers was very impressed by that, and but then escorted the Cowmans to England on another deputation tour. But it was that BTI, Bible Training Institute in Tokyo, which prompted him to open his Bible Training College in Clapham Common, England, 5 years later. So it all gets symbiotic, how they all kind of overlap and mix together. And so that was what was going on there. Traveling, lots of deputation, lots of riding back and forth across the oceans. They spent time in the United Kingdom and as well as the United States. That's where the majority of their donors came from, and it was small. They went to all the camp meetings on the East Coast every summer, or almost every summer, raising funds. And at that point in time, Japan had been a closed country for so long. No one knew where Japan was or what it was. So Lettie and Charles would wear their kimonos, and she would sing Japanese songs for them so they'd get a feel for how it was.
Okay. Yeah, Michelle, can you talk about the Great Village campaign?
Yes, the Great Village campaign was really surprising. For a couple of years, I'd ask everyone I knew, have you ever heard of the Great Village campaign? And I only ran to 3 people who'd ever heard of it. But this came out of an idea of someone asking Lettie when she was in England, how much would we need to donate for our little women's group for a whole village to receive the gospel? Because those Bible Training Institute students were being sent out as missionaries to preach the gospel. They did it every night, getting people to the talks and then out into the countryside. So Charles, who was a businessman, calculated about £5 would give the gospel to everyone in a Japanese village. And from that, he plotted and he thought and he prayed, and the Lord showed him, why don't you do it in Japan? So between 1912 and the beginning of 1918, a group of missionaries, mostly students from their Bible Training Institute, but also with a couple of Westerners, visited and left a gospel tract and a piece of the Gospels at every doorstep in Japan. 10.2 million houses visited and left with a gospel message.
That's staggering numbers.
Yeah. And they walked everywhere. I mean, they were typically they were wearing out one pair of shoes a month because they were everywhere. And they went up cliffs and down valleys and off to sea, and yeah, quite a bit. When Charles and Lettie were in Japan, they would take little forays as well. But as best they can tell, and certainly the men were earnest to get there. They hit every home in Japan. I mean, these were honorable people. Now, the Great Village Campaign, though, because they had promised to do it in 5 years to visit 10.2 million homes. You guys can do the math. That's quite a few places to go to every single day. They went to God's Bible School on their deputation looking for 10 men who would volunteer to go to Japan for a year. That's what they did, and that's what happened. Those 10 men, with, again, plenty of Japanese students, canvassed the entire country and finished in 1918. Funding all that, organizing all that, running all that, destroyed Charles Cowman's health. And just before the end of the campaign, a physician in Japan said he has to go home or he will die. He had serious heart angina, and they sent him home to Pasadena, which is where their headquarters were at the time.
So if you look at the Christian population in Japan today, I'm curious if you have any statistics for us. It's about 120 years later. Would you say that campaign was successful in spreading the gospel?
It depends how you define successful.
Yeah.
And that's really the core message. If anyone is saved, I mean, the Lord sees all of us as the same. One person is just as valuable as another. We Americans would look at that and think, oh gosh, there should have been at least 50% should be Christians in Japan. But that's not how God worked. And their real better mission, if you will, was in Korea, where as even now, the Korean Holiness Church is one of the largest churches in the world, or in Korea. In Japan, well, there were a lot of other issues going on, and including World War II. But OMS saw themselves as starting the Bible school, preparing people from the community, Japanese people, to preach the gospel in their own churches. They were setting those up. And then when they were done, which they felt they were done, getting themselves established in 1923, then they left it to the national church and they moved to the next station. That was their form. So 1% of the population now, they say, are Christians. But again, if you're one of those 1%, thanks be to God. I was thinking about this question because China, think of what happened with China. All the missionaries who went there to die in the 19th century, then the 20th century, all the people who have been killed in China. And yet those seeds, there are more Christians in China than any other country in the world now. So those lives were given for good purpose, for the kingdom of God.
Yeah. And we never know what God is going to do, with those seeds that were planted, even at that time, even if we can't see in Japan the fruit of it yet, even, or it doesn't look the way that we think it should. But obviously the Cowmans had this heart for evangelism. Did streams in the desert play a part in this worldwide evangelism effort that was so much a part of their heart?
Well, yes. When they got back to Pasadena, or to Los Angeles, where their headquarters were, Charles Cowman had such severe angina that he couldn't sleep at night. And so that's when Lettie began reading to him and finding anything to encourage him. And it took him 7 years to die. Over the course of that, she would sing songs, she'd play the piano, and so forth. And then that last year, 1923, that he was alive, they put together the devotional Streams in the Desert. And as I indicated earlier, he lived to see it, and he died in September of 1924, which absolutely devastated her. Again, they had no children. This was her whole life. Lettie was she had never packed her own suitcase before Charles died. Okay, that's hard for me personally to imagine because I'm a Navy wife. I've been packing my whole married life. But she just wasn't trained in that. She just grew up in a banker's household, a husband who was devoted to her, and he took care of her, and there she was. So she took a couple of years to grieve. She wrote a biography of her husband, and but it was hard for her. And it was probably maybe a year or so into her grief that they needed someone to go back to England to do some more deputation. So off she went, and once she started speaking again, she got herself into the groove, and she was off. And she spent pretty much the rest of her life speaking to audiences, groups, and talking to them. And the money they earned from Streams in the Desert is what funded it all. She just gave all the money back to the One Mission Society, or Oriental Missionary Society. And she was a folksy character. She always carried copies of her book with her. She handed them out indiscriminately and was happy to speak about the Great Village Campaign and One Mission Society, Oriental Mission Society. I have to remember that. His friend Kilbourne became the president after Charles Cowman died, but Ernest Kilbourne died early as well. And in 1928-ish, 29, 28, Lettie became the president of the Oriental Missionary Society, which is, best I can tell, she was the first female president of an international missionary society. And off she went. She had her own cute little way of doing things, and she was a great woman of prayer. If there was anything complicated, she'd go off and pray. She'd play her piano. She had a piano put into her office, and play her piano and sing hymns. And she customarily prayed and sang hymns for up to 3 hours, 4 hours a day, every morning. That's where she began. If there were any conflict within the office, she'd say, we have to pray. She had no compunction about calling people in to kneel and to pray. So she began fundraising, and Streams in the Desert was doing really well. And she had written a couple other books after that. One in particular, Compassion, came out during World War II when so many men were dying during the war. But the writing comes a bit later. In 1936, Rhys Howells, the president of the Bible College of Wales, read a copy of Missionary Warrior, and he wrote to her and asked her if she'd come and speak to his Every Creature campaign conference being held in the fall or the late summer of 1936. So she thought about it and decided, well, okay. And so by herself, she took the train all the way across America, got on a boat, sailed all the way to Liverpool, and spoke as the keynote speaker for a week at this missionary conference. We're now down to worldwide evangelism here.
Yeah. So, and that's a significant time during Europe's history.
Yes, she was sailing at the same time as the 1936 Olympic team was going to Berlin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The storm clouds were gathering. OMS had gone after it went to Korea and went into China, just as everybody else was leaving China. They established a Bible school in Shanghai and one in Beijing. And she had a variety of people working on that. Most of the members of her board of directors were in the Far East, including Ernest Kilbourne's son, who was running the mission there. So at the end of this 7-day conference, where she was the keynote speaker, Rhys Howells, who was, of course, a great man of prayer, pulled her aside and said, you're not done with your life yet. You need to go off and pray. We will bring you food. You can play the piano whenever you want. And when you get the word that God gives you, then you come out and we'll see what he's going to say to you. So she's perfectly fine with praying. So she prayed, walked in the garden, played the piano for a week. And on Sunday morning, woke up with a word that God was giving her the world, basically, the Southland. I should pull it up here with the exact verses. She always would go to the Old Testament and wander through the Old Testament and then find something that God seemed to be highlighting, and she would snatch that up, and away she goes. All right, Jeremiah 1:5. I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. So she wasn't sure what that meant, but thought she'd go to church. And the person who was preaching at that church service preached on Jeremiah 1:5. Someone stood up in the service and gave a word out of Jeremiah 1:5. Well, that was the third time. She's like, okay, this must be it, but what does that even mean? So she went walking in the garden, and a couple approached her from Finland, the missionaries from Finland, the Matsons, and they said, you need to come to Finland and tell your stories because we need a Great Village campaign in Finland. Well, I only came for a couple of weeks in the summer. Finland has got snow. And they said, well, no, God will work it out. And they were going back on a freighter. The captain gave her his stateroom. That was the last, bed on the boat. He gave it to her. And instead of going home to Los Angeles, where she was supposed to go, she went to Finland and did not return to Los Angeles for 18 months because she was traveling the world. And that was the beginning of what they called the Great Village campaign. Started in Finland. It went to Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and it ended in Romania when Hitler began marching in. It was the last gospel campaign to Eastern Europe before the Iron Curtain fell down. The last time the gospel was distributed until the end of the Iron Curtain.
So was it similar to what you said? It was called the Great Gospel or the Village Campaign too. So is that the same as?
Well, it was fashioned after the Great Village campaign, which is what had happened earlier, and then then she called it Every Creature. It was the Every Creature campaign, and the idea was that they would share the gospel with every creature in the world. Wow. And that's why it was a gospel tract and a gospel piece. And that was the last freely given gospel distribution behind the Iron Curtain, what became the Iron Curtain.
So literally, she was a worldwide evangelist. Like she preached the gospel everywhere she went, and she went all over the world and was talking to people from all kinds of different backgrounds.
Absolutely. And it turned out that Streams in the Desert was a large part of opening those doors because she kept running into people who'd heard of Streams in the Desert or knew about Streams in the Desert, and they were willing to help her, willing to translate the book. And all the funds that were, all the royalties went into these campaigns. And that's what she did. It took her to Israel. She met the Crown Prince of Egypt. And when she returned finally to England, the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie had heard about her and wanted to meet her. So she went to tea with the Matsons, who knew Haile Selassie, and Haile Selassie and his family. He was in Bath. He had been thrown out of Ethiopia. Abyssinia was in Bath. And she had a word for him. God gave her a word. I mean, she was a prophet. And she spoke to him and told him, you will be returned to your throne, and it is coming. And he was flabbergasted. He says, ever since I came to England, a Christian nation, no one has encouraged me like this. No one's told me what God is doing. You're the first person who has done this. And of course, he was returned to the throne, 6, 7, 8 years later. Maybe not even that long, a couple of years later.
Yeah, it's very remarkable just to be able to speak into like the life of a world leader like that and to have him be so encouraged. You've alluded to this idea that she would receive words from the Lord. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Like how did that happen for her?
Well, she would go and spend a couple of hours, and her take on prayer is you prayed until you got breakthrough. You prayed until God answered you, whatever direction it was. And that comes out in some of her Streams in the Desert talks, or, some of the devotions out of Streams in the Desert. And she would go in and play her piano and sing and listen and scour scripture, and then the Lord would highlight it in some way. And that she'd come out, and that was her answer. It drove her staff crazy in Los Angeles. Yeah, she'd have to go figure something out. She'd go off and play her piano and sing, and then she'd come back with some obscure word out of Zephaniah, and yet that would be the way the missionary movement turned. It was an interesting way of handling it. When she finally returned to Los Angeles, because after she went all over Europe, she came back to LA, dealt with some stuff in LA, but then she went to Cuba for a every creature campaign. She went to Mexico, here, there, and everywhere. And about the time World War II ended, because remember, all of her board of directors were they were in a camp. They were in Wiesen prison camp there, the same one where Eric Liddell was. They were incommunicado for a couple of years because they were prisoners of war in Japan or Manchuria or wherever they were. Anyway, they come back, and one of them had been praying while he was in the camp and discovered that Lettie had gotten the same answer to prayer, which was that they needed to start a Bible college in South America. So he and a couple other men went to South America scouting for a place to have a Bible college or Bible training school, just as always. They found a place in Colombia, and they found the perfect place in Colombia, and they had Medellin. They had to put down all the money the next day, $20,000. So what were they supposed to do? They just wired back to the main office, can you get us $20,000 overnight? Well, it actually didn't matter, because when they went to the mailbox the next day, there was $20,000 in cash that Lettie had told her financial secretary to send to them 2 weeks before. So she's hearing God and then acting. She didn't sit around like I often do and think, is that really you? That doesn't make any sense, Lord. No. She just goes. And that Bible school is still going in Colombia now.
Oh, so she's just like hopping all over the world. That's like another continent that let's go there too now.
Totally. And, because God will give you the Southland. That was the word she got on that one, which is why they went south. But that's when they changed the name to One Mission, or a variation of One Mission Society, because they were no longer only in the Orient. They'd also gone into India. She never went to India, but some of her missionaries the missionaries with OMS went into India. Eventually, though, she got tired. Obviously, she got tired, and she never was particularly good at money management. As long as she had people organizing her, it was working. But, 1950 came around. She was 80 years old, and it was time for her to retire. So she didn't want to, but she did, and she had a house there in Los Angeles, and she had gotten another word that she was going to live to be 95 years old. So she was like, well, I can't go out to pasture. I've got 15 more years. But in the end, she actually only lived 90 years, and she died on Easter Sunday when she was 90 years old in 1960.
Yeah. Michelle, you personally have not served as a missionary, is that correct?
I have not. I tip my hat to all of you who have, but I have not been a missionary.
How did doing all of this research and learning about Lettie, how has that impacted you or kind of changed your perspective on missions or missionaries?
Well, I have a number of friends who are missionaries, and I was just so impressed. I came away so amazed by the sacrifices and choices people made that I actually dedicated this book to all the missionaries I know. People who've served either on the mission field or who've run camps, anything like that. I just, that was obvious, including the OMS people. Because it was interesting to me, I was writing this during COVID, and right as COVID fell, the two missionary friends there in the front of my book were stuck in the United States. They were here on furlough and they got stuck. And both of them, one was young and one was 70 years old, who had been the kindergarten teacher in Papua New Guinea for a long, long time. They were desperate to get back to their stations. And I was like, why would you do that? You can help here with the kids being homeschooled. And, I don't understand this. And they were like, no, God called us here. This is where we need to be. I'm not in the right place if I'm in the United States, even if I do get to have lunch with you. And the younger one was on the second flight out back to Europe, where she's stationed when it lifted in Europe. And the 70-year-old woman couldn't go the simpler way, which was Northern California to Australia and up to Papua New Guinea, because Australia was closed. She went the other way. She took 3 red eyes to go the other way around the world to get back to her duty station there to teach kindergarten to the MAF pilot children in Papua New Guinea. And I thought, okay, I am just like a weakling. I need to really respect and honor all the people who have just given so much for the gospel. And kind of goes back to the question about there's only 1% Christians in Japan now. Well, but if you're among that 1%, that missionary coming through means you're going to be in heaven. And that's why it's an honor, really, to have told the story, because so many people have done so many extraordinary things and they've been lost to history unless we tell the stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's really what this podcast has been all about. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Our primary audience is Christian women who are ministering cross-culturally around the world. You have been so immersed in Lettie's life. I'm wondering if you have gleaned any key principles or anything that you think that might be relevant for people who are doing work today in cross-cultural settings, things that either positive or negative examples, even just things that we can take away for today. Understanding that historical context is different, but maybe there's some things that transcend time.
Well, Lettie had a real heart for her missionaries out on the field, particularly the women. She remembered when she had been a wife on the mission field, not able to cook. And so she was always watching out for the wives. She would send them clothing. She'd send them patterns. She always came with presents for them. She had a keen ear to listen to them, to hear their stories, and was always encouraging people when she was visiting on the mission field. Yeah, and I have friends who've served, and being able to hear from home, yes, but to be respected for the work that you're doing so far from home, I think is also really important. Lettie was very careful to protect, if she could, the women in particular in the mission field, and that's the very least we can do. If you're going to be dealing with cockroaches, you can have more money or gifts or whatever. It's just like. I just think it's important to respect them and to honor their sacrifice. And it's not easy to be on the mission field, to be far from home for so long. It's probably a little easier now because we have the internet. But yeah, I think the best example was her hours of prayer to put it all into God's hand. And I just told you a couple stories of miracles, but there are all sorts of things where information came at the right time, the right place. And anybody who's on the mission field is in a spiritual battle, and to be able to be encouraged that way is what my role is here. So thank you, all you people out there sharing the gospel at great sacrifice. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Michelle, I think we could probably point to so many things in Lettie's life that were amazing. This book that 100 years later is still impacting people, and some of the stories that you have shared with us are just really incredible. And yet, like you just said, the thing that has struck me in all that you have talked about is this prayer and this wanting to hear from the Lord. And in the midst of, needing to make decisions, going away and, walking outside with the Lord or playing the piano, and just, her heart for prayer. I just love that. And as you think about all that you have shared with us and all that how would you sum up Lettie's legacy?
Well, she was a woman devoted to her God, and nothing else was as important as that relationship with Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit. That was where her focus lay. Yes, she loved everybody. She loved the women, missionaries in particular. She adored her husband. But her real heart, all those years ago in Chicago, was given to Jesus, and nothing else compared to that. Not being a banker's daughter, beautiful clothing. Yeah, it was being able to share the love of Jesus. And that shines through all the way through Streams in the Desert.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see the steadfastness of her decisions, as you had pointed out at the beginning, of just when she decided, she was all in. Whatever she did, it was everything of all of who she was that she put into it.
And it's not to say she had an easy life. She had a lot of hardship. Her health was peculiar from time to time, and losing her husband nearly destroyed her. But Jesus was still there, and he's there for all of us, which is encouraging.
Right.
I imagine many of our listeners probably have experienced reading through her devotional and received some of that encouragement that continues to be passed down through the generations of just that strong connection she had with God and then sharing it with her readers. So if any of our listeners are interested in learning more about Michelle and her research about Lettie Cowman, you can read her blog posts and learn more about Lettie, the OMS, and Streams in the Desert, and other research that Michelle's done at her website, and that's www.michelleyule.com, and Yule is spelled U-L-E.
That's it.
So I know there's lots more there that you could dig into if you'd like to learn more and just see what else Michelle's been up to.
Yeah, and we will add that in the show notes as well.
There's one more thing I'd like to say. When I spoke at OMS last summer, the word that God gave me for them, because these are all missionaries, was that it's really important that they remember that God sees them, that He knows them. He knows their circumstances. He knows the plans He has for them, and they are good, and not to feel forgotten because they are not forgotten. Mm-hmm. It's a good message for all of us, but that day it was really important for them to know that, their lives are a joy to the Lord because they are. And that would be true of you too. So there you go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing your wisdom, your research, all the knowledge you have of Lettie Cowman's life and legacy. We've been so blessed by your presence with us here today.
Oh, thank you. It's been an honor.
Yeah, and friends, this is our last episode of season 2. We are so thankful that you have joined us for this year, for this season, and we hope that these stories and interviews have been a blessing to you. There's so much goodness to come in season 3, so come back, join us again, and we're just so grateful that you are part of this community and that you listen to this podcast. Thanks, friends, for being with us for this episode of the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast.
What a pleasure to be home in you, God. What a treasure to be found in you. Ooh.